right, welcome everyone. I just circulated the link to the YouTube for anybody that is trying to get in that way. So far we have about 35 people signed in. I think people are going to continue signing in as we go, but I'd like to get us up and running because of a very packed agenda. If there are any problems in the meeting, please email me. You can also, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you can contact me through the Q&A or through the chat feature. Both of those are available and will kind of let me and the other panelists know if there are any issues. The other thing you can do as an attendee is if you would like to speak, we're going to ask folks to raise their hand. You should have a little hand in the bottom window on the right-hand side. If you raise your hand, we'll be able to unmute you guys and allow participants to speak directly to the panelists. Our agenda for today, we're going to have two introductory presentations, one from Dr. Zook with the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. Then we're going to have another from Ray Byrne, who's the manager of Electric Power Systems Research Department at Sandia National Labs. And then we'll have our two main presentations from Howard Pessell and Will McNamara, who are also with Sandia. So without further ado, I'm going to unmute Dr. Zook, and I am going to launch his presentation. Dr. Zook, are you there?
I have just, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've lost the video.
I am opening it up right. Oh, you've lost video of us?
Yes.
I gotcha. And I am, give me 1 second to pull up your PowerPoint.
I have the Zoom meeting up.
You might need to switch to a different window.
Well, yeah, like where?
I don't know. If you want to just open up your PowerPoint, I have your first slide live on the screen for everyone.
Okay, let me bring the thing up on a different computer. I think I'm going to sign in again. I'm going to go out and sign in again. Obviously, there should be a something to click, but I have no idea what to click at the moment.
All right, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to launch a quick poll to see who's in our audience, and everybody can kind of get a chance to let us know what their kind of background is, where they're from. We can get a little bit of idea of who we're speaking to here. We got about half of the folks who have voted so far, so we're going to give it another 20 seconds or so.
It may be possible to bring the screen back because I'm still in Zoom.
I don't know. Dr. Zook, I'm going to go ahead and mute you for just a minute. All right, so most folks have responded, so I'm going to end the poll. And it looks like we're mostly utilities and government, which is interesting. So everybody can see, I think we've got a lot of government folks that are working from home and trying to fill their time today. Ray, do you want to go ahead and do your intro first? And then we can come back when Dr. Zook is up and running? Does that work?
Yes.
All right, so I'm done with the poll. Why don't you go ahead and take over the screen?
Okay. All right, so my name is Ray Byrne. I manage the Electric Power Systems Research Department at Sandia, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the grid modernization work going on at Sandia. The power grid, as everyone knows, is quickly evolving. There are a lot of new threats out there, like cyber threats, physical threats. There have been a lot of extreme weather events over the last few years that have brought attention to grid resilience. Then there's also just standard reliability needs that need to be met. We've got aging infrastructure, new generation sources like wind and solar that are highly variable. We're increasing customer participation in electricity markets. And then we've got this huge new potential for electrification of vehicles that's going to cause a huge strain to the electric power grid. So Sandia has been involved in grid modernization for quite some time. It actually goes back to the 1970s with the energy crisis. More recently, we've done a lot of work related to semiconductor devices and power modules to enable grid-tied energy storage, as well as a lot of cybersecurity work. The Sandia Grid Modernization team is led by Charlie Hanley, who's senior manager. I lead the transmission planning, operations, and controls area. Summer Ferreira leads the renewable and distributed system integration work. And then Babu Chowmala leads the energy storage research program under Dr. Zook. Craig Lawton leads defense energy, and then Brian Gaines leads grid security. So we've got a lot of facilities and labs at Sandia that enable a lot of the grid research we do. This includes the Distributed Energy Technologies Laboratory, where we have several types of small microgrids. We also have a National Solar Thermal Test Facility, which is a full-scale solar facility. And then we do a lot of work characterizing aging of semiconductor devices and solar cells at the P-Cell laboratory. The energy storage program is central to Sandia's grid modernization program. The main thrust areas are materials and systems development, power electronics, safety and reliability, demonstration and testing, grid analytics and policy, which covers a lot of these outreach activities like the presentation today, and then also outreach activities directly to states and other entities. So that's kind of a quick overview. With that, I'll turn it over back to Dr. Zook, who can give you an overview of his overall program.
All right, Dr. Zook, are you ready? I'm going to launch
Yes.
your PowerPoint. All right, let me hop up here.
Excellent.
All right.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. Hello. I am Imre Duk, and I direct the Energy Storage Research Program in the Office of Electricity at the Department of Energy. And well, I will give you an introduction to energy storage for resilience, stability, and a greener grid. Next. The Office of Electricity Storage Program has the entire range of research involved. So we do research into materials, we do deployment, we do analysis, and it spans the spectrum from materials to devices, to systems, to analysis, standards, policy, and on to finance and actual construction of facilities. We are teaming with Sandia, P&L, Oak Ridge, and to a lesser degree with Argonne and Los Alamos. And the aim is to work with industry, states, and utilities. We have been fairly successful in our work. In fact, most of what you see in the energy storage world was started at one time or another by our program. And we have 10 R&D 100 awards, the Oscars of technology, and 2 EPA Green Chemistry Awards for the program. Next. So this is how the program lays out. We have certain core areas of research on materials, things like zinc manganese, aqueous soluble organics, and sodium batteries. Then it goes into power electronics, which we do. We work on vanadium flow batteries, safety, a very important aspect, reliability with test centers. And this is an example here, state regulatory support. We work with PUCs and state regulatory agencies. We evaluate use cases. We develop performance protocols, and again, safety codes and standards. Next, please. Okay, it's all about having energy storage that works as a business case. And to do a business case, you have to play between cost and value, and these are not the same things, but eventually they should meet in the middle. The cost of a storage system depends on the storage device, first of all, the battery basically, but that's not the only thing, because the power electronics is very important too, and the balance of plant. The balance of plants is something which often we neglect to think of, but you have to remember that the batteries have to go into packs, the packs go into racks, the racks are inside a building, the building has to have air conditioning and fire control systems, and then the building has to stand on a property which you have to rent or buy, and then comes the building inspector and the insurance and perhaps the reinsurance, and then come the lawyers, and all of that takes a considerable part of the cost of a storage system. Now, the value of the storage system depends on whether you are in a regulated utility or an unregulated utility. But you have such things as arbitrage, frequency regulation, demand charges, which come by the month and the year. And then you come with unmonetized values such as resiliency. And those are difficult, but often very important. Next, please. So this is about building and validating business cases for resilience, sustainability, and grid stability. Next. Yeah, these values, resiliency, military energy assurance, emergency preparedness, are difficult to monetize. But often they are really the first thing that is in people's minds. Things like a recent disaster. People feel that they need storage, and then comes the justification. Microgrids with renewables and storage are good solutions for resiliency. But if we want to have a business case, then generally it is difficult to rest it on the unmonetized aspects, and you have to rest it on the monetized benefit streams which are available. And that's where the analysis comes in, the analytics. Next, please. So we have a good example here. Sterling, Massachusetts. They received a grant from Massachusetts. Actually, 11 municipalities received these grants. And, it was $1.5 million. And then they say, okay, what do we do now? So we adopted one of them, so to speak, and worked with them through the entire process. The first thing we did was to do an analysis. Ray Byrne did the analysis and essentially worked out how much the benefits of arbitrage, monthly peaks, annual peaks would amount to. And we found that for a 2 megawatt system, we could realize $400,000 in benefits every month. And so one fine day in October 2016, we were out there with our shovels breaking ground. And 3 months later, we had a brand new energy storage system connected into a microgrid. And the graph shows you how the benefits came in. You can see the monthly peaks accruing over the months, and then a jump when the yearly peak comes in. And altogether, this amounts to quite a bit of money. In fact, after 2.5 years, we had realized $1 million in avoided cost for Sterling, Massachusetts. And incidentally, the place has become quite famous as an excellent example of energy storage in a microgrid, and has had visitors from Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, and so on. Many countries have sent delegations to look at the microgrid. Next, please. Here's another example, and these examples may all be treated later on in the series of presentations in more detail. This one is in Cordova, Alaska, and it's a municipal system. It's a small town that's electrically completely isolated. They rely on a run-of-the-river hydro, but that's difficult to control. And the following the load was done by means of diesel generators. Diesel is expensive up there. As you can see, it's $0.6 dollars per kilowatt. The hydro is 0.06 cents per kilowatt. So our plan, which we realized, was to put in a megawatt of storage and essentially eliminate the diesel and make the hydropower able to follow the load. And this has worked very well. They now have a nice hydro system. Next, please. You can see the ribbon cutting with Senator Markowski there. And this is the storage unit. And it does frequency regulation, load following, and it acts as an emergency supply for the town in case there is a glitch or anything goes wrong. Next, please. Here is a system for which we did the analytics. It was done by National Grid using Tesla batteries, and the analytics was done by Pacific Northwest Laboratories. The situation there was that there were two supply lines into the island of Nantucket. And because there are a lot of tourists on Nantucket, the peaks in the summer where the load peaks were becoming bigger and bigger. And it was clear that sooner or later, the two supply lines would not be enough and a third one would have to be installed. Well, it was suggested that storage would be a good solution for this because the third line is not needed all the time, but only for the peaks. And so P&L did a careful analytics evaluation to look at the benefits and costs, either by using a third under submarine cable or by putting in storage. And it turns out that storage is much the better solution. We were able to realize $110 million in deferral value and an extra $36 million operational benefits over the life of the project. Next, please. And again, you see the ribbon cutting here to make sure that it's real, and the installation down in the right-hand corner. The return on investment is very good, 1.5, which is excellent for any investment. That's another fairly recent project, October 8th, 2019. Next, please. So we have a lot of projects like this ongoing. We work with the Albuquerque, New Mexico public school system. We have a project with a pueblo in New Mexico. We work with Iowa to develop a 6 to 8 hour backup for existing and planned renewables. We have 3 projects involving rural co-ops, and 2 of those are joint with military reservations. We work on a resiliency project in Alaska, and really ambitious. We work with a consortium of 5 towns in Puerto Rico in the Central Mountains who would like to form a microgrid powered by 250 megawatts of solar and hydro with 75 megawatts of storage. It's a big project. We may not be able to carry it off, but we're going to try. Next, please. What I'm really after there is to create storage ecologies. And these are beginning to take place in California with a mandate and the major utilities, in New York with BEST, NYSERDA, and again, colleges like City College, New York, the Northwest states, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. They have PNL, the National Laboratory, the Washington Clean Energy Fund, the PUCs, and a strong voice in the Senate. New Mexico is another one with Sandia, and Massachusetts with the Doer projects. And what is needed for these storage ecologies to emerge is congressional and state support, regulatory structure, preferably a national laboratory, universities, utilities, and real projects on the ground. Next, please. There are states with big plans: California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York. All of those are planning hundreds, if not thousands of megawatts in the reasonably near future. Even states like Arizona, Maine, and Nevada are coming in with sizable projects. Next, please. DOE does technical assistance for many of the states. We held a symposium in the Southeast. We have a half-day workshop in New Mexico, workshops in Michigan, Arizona, the California Energy Commission, Maine, North Carolina, Rhode Island, now in Maryland. Nevada PUC is coming up. Has already taken place. And we talk on modeling, interconnection, commissioning, safety, and coming up is a New England conference of PUCs involving the northeastern states. Next. So energy storage has become a resounding success. All predictions show that we are going to have very considerable deployment of energy storage throughout the country, And this deployment will be in residential situations, in non-residential situations, and behind the meter. Next, please. So the technology that is incumbent is lithium ion. Most of those installations are lithium ion. However, we realize that lithium ion is not an ideal technology. There are ecological and sociological issues. There are safety and reliability issues, and there definitely are issues on reuse, recycling, and disposal. Next, please. The pro of lithium-ion batteries is low cost, and they are market ready. The cost has been steadily declining. And the technology is by now fairly familiar. On the con side, the cycle life is definitely less than 20 years. Usually you can be lucky if you get 8 years. There is a capacity fade that lithium ion systems show. So you have to over specify the capacity. There are safety issues. There is no US manufacturing of any magnitude. And above all, there is no recycling. So on the safety issues, for example, there have been 15 megawatt scale fires in Korea during 2017. There has been a rather devastating fire in Arizona. There are 225 aviation incidents. So there is a lot of problems that are still resolved. They are not always necessarily inherent. Sometimes they are caused by the power electronics, but nonetheless, this issue is there. Material scientists are working hard to create lithium technologies that are less prone to fires, but nonetheless, here it is. Next, please. The recycling is a problem. Recycling can be done, but it is not done on any public scale because it simply isn't profitable at the moment. The best thing that you might recycle is not so much the lithium, but the cobalt and nickel contained in these batteries. And those are precisely what we want to eliminate. Next, please. So materials research is carried on safety, reliability, and recycling, and new technologies are being developed. Among other things, we are developing a very big grid storage launch pad at Pacific Northwest Laboratory. Next, please. And this is what you have to look for in the future. You have to look for elements in your batteries which are earth abundant. So ultimately, we would like to build batteries that are built out of common minerals and things that, well, are inside our own bodies. Next, please. So what are the cost goals for these new technologies? Lithium ion, we can aim for about $100 per kilowatt hour. Vanadium, we have brought down, these are flow batteries, $300 per kilowatt hour. Promising technologies that we are working on, zinc manganese oxide might go down to $50 per kilowatt hour. Low temperature sodium ion could be as low as $60 per kilowatt hour. A promising approach are aqueous soluble organics, which might go to $125. And we should not forget lead acid batteries, which can be completely recycled or almost completely recycled. And they might go down to $35 per kilowatt hours. Next, please. So new things are on the horizon, as I mentioned, non-lithium technologies. such as better lithium, vanadium redox batteries, and the others that I've listed. Iron chlorine is a possibility. But we might also see non-battery technologies, particularly as we go into long duration systems. People are doing things like stacking up cement blocks with a crane, or railroad tracks that will move box carts up an incline. This could be a matter of storing energy for weeks, because as we get more and more solar, we will want to store energy for multiple days and possibly weeks, because you may have rainy days, and above all, you have nighttime. Vehicle to grid is another important aspect that's being considered, where you use your car batteries as backup or for your house, or as interacting with the grid. So long duration storage is in the wings, possibly in combination with storing such things as hydrogen and ammonia, which have great energy content and are clean for the environment. Next, please. So we are doing other efforts like the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, which has regular webinars which are available for free. These addresses will be archived. Next. We have the Energy Storage Database, where we have archived almost $2 million projects from 60 countries, and you can check out how other storage installations are doing. Next, please. It's free. We have an energy storage policy database, which is being maintained. If you go into what the policies are around the country. Next, please. And in conclusion, with new technologies, cost will go down and safety and reliability will increase. And with every successful project, the value proposition will continue to increase and more jobs will be created. Next, please. Energy storage should be in the toolbox of every utilities. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to take down the PowerPoint. Real quick before we do, we did receive one question in the Q&A from Tom Shetty. It's whether or not there's been any effort towards quantifying resiliency. Dr. Zook, I don't know if you want to answer that or if that's something that's going to come up in one later.
We are all working hard at doing that.
All right. So we're working on resiliency.
Yeah, all the laboratories and organizations such as EPRI and so on are trying to get a handle on resiliency. It's not easy, but at least aspects of resiliency can be quantified, but it's difficult to get a single metric for resiliency.
All right, so are there any other questions for Dr. Zook before we move on to, I believe Howard is our next presenter. We did receive another question from Kevin Porter. It's what does Dr. Zook mean by aviation incidents?
Oh, fires on airplanes, like the big Boeing fire.
Anything else? All right, Dr. Zook, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I'm going to unmute Howard. All right, Howard, you have the mic.
Thank you, Molly. Do you want to advance my slides or do you want me to advance them from here?
If you can get your screen sharing to work, then you should go right ahead.
That's the big test though, huh? Do you see my screen? Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure how to get into the presentation mode from here. And I'm afraid to mess around too much, so I might just scroll up and down if that's okay with everybody. Okay, well, so hi everybody. Dr. Juk, thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to make another introduction, and I'll try not to be too repetitive, and maybe this will complement Dr. Juk's fine overview. I want to say thanks to Molly. She's been terrific. She is really making this work, often with a baby on one hip and another one playing on the floor. And so her enthusiasm and her energy and professionalism has been extremely valuable. And I also want to say thanks to all of my colleagues who are presenting either today or who will be presenting over the next few weeks. We have a great lineup, and I love these workshops because I learn so much every time, and we have some great experts who are going to be speaking from Sandia and from PNNL and from Quanta Technologies in addition. So let's see. Okay, are you seeing my next slide, SNL outreach to regulators? As Dr. Juk described, this is part of an outreach program funded by DOE Office of Electricity Energy Storage Programs. We've been putting on these workshops now for a couple of years. Here are all the places we put them on. And we've got a good list of workshops coming up. It has been interrupted a little bit by the current state of affairs, but we are trying to carry on, as you can see, with this effort to do it remotely. I hope it works. And actually, we'd be happy to hear from folks about how well this seems to work. Let's see. I want to frame the whole discussion just a little bit. The energy transition, a phrase that I don't think I heard before a year or 2 years ago, is happening right now. We're in the midst of it all. There's this quote from Buckminster Fuller that I've always been enamored with for a really long time. If you were in a shipwreck and a piano top came floating by, you might climb on top of it and use it as a life preserver. But if you were in the business of designing life preservers, you would not make them in the shape of a piano top. And I think that characterizes the human condition with regards to technology adoption over all of human civilization, maybe, and certainly over the last few hundred years. One might argue that fossil fuels is a good example of that. We grasped at fossil fuels, and it has done a tremendous amount of good and maybe bad in the world. It's created a population boom. It's created economic development all over the world. It's created climate issues. So for better or worse, we've got that technology now, and we're in this transition away from it. This transition is hot and heavy. All of the reasons that it's happening are shown there: climate crisis, declining costs for renewables, public health issues, geopolitics, ecosystem health. Anyway, it's really rocking and rolling right now. And partly because of that, energy dynamics, I'm on the next slide, energy dynamics are fundamentally different all over the country, all over the world. Demand for new generation is flat or declining, so utilities and regulatory commissions don't have to build new generation. Decarbonization and electrification, again, are terms that I'm not sure they certainly were not as common a couple years ago as they are now. Coal is on its way out, PV and storage is on its way in, wholesale markets and retail markets are all shifting dramatically. And the model that we've been using to manage the development of the electricity business around the United States and probably around the world is just not, it's not as applicable now. It doesn't fit as well. We're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, and it's creating all kinds of problems that we need to work to overcome. And I'll say that since Will and I and others in our group have been working with regulatory commissions around the country, the sense we've gotten is that the job that regulatory commissions have now is way more challenging than it has been for the last 100 years or so, way more complicated. And generally, we're finding that commissions are understaffed and underfunded. And so we are delighted to be able to hopefully help and see if we can provide some, extra leverage to help commissions and utilities figure out how to adopt energy storage. So along with the energy landscape being different, energy storage is different. It's a load and a generation source. It's both. And so recently in one of these workshops, Charlie Vartanian from PNNL said, that one of our problems is we're trying to make energy storage fit into our existing model of electricity dynamics in the country. Really, it's a separate category. It's neither a load nor a generation source. It's something completely new, and we haven't figured out what kind of category to put it into just yet. It facilitates demand management in a way that we've never been able to do before. It defers new generation and transmission infrastructure, which is something Ralph Masiello will talk about later on in this series. It unleashes the power of renewables. It provides services and value streams that Dr. Juk mentioned, and it provides flexibility, resilience, and reliability that the grid may have never seen before, and which needs increasingly now that there are so many new kinds of demands being placed upon the grid. So I want to spend a few minutes going over some terms and language that are common in energy storage. And this looks really pedantic, and I want to really not let it be that, but I think it's also a good opportunity to just discuss concepts. A watt is a joule per second. It's a very small amount of energy. It's a very small amount of energy. So it's important for me to keep this straight, to remember that a watt is a joule per second. And so a kilowatt is 1,000 joules per second, and a kilowatt hour is 1,000 joules per second per hour. So that just complicates the unit just a little bit. We've got two different categories that we talk about all the time when we're talking about electricity and energy storage. One is power, one is energy. So power is a measure of the maximum generation capacity from a system, and energy is a measure of the maximum capacity over time. And those are important. We use those terms differently all the time, and they can be a little bit confusing. I'm sure there are professionals on this online here for whom this is nothing new, but maybe there are some folks who will benefit from some of this stuff. So a 40 megawatt 4-hour battery, you'll see batteries and energy storage systems described with different sets of metrics. A 40 megawatt 4-hour battery is a 160 megawatt hour battery. A 40 megawatt hour battery could provide 40 megawatts for an hour, 20 megawatts for 2 hours, and so on. At the bottom of this slide, you see different energy applications and different power applications. Energy applications are generally over longer periods of time, power applications over shorter periods of time. And so you see this list, and I won't go through the list. Ray Byrne is going to talk about this. You'll see this list again, actually, when Ray makes his presentation next week. And Patrick Balducci from PNNL will also be talking about some of this stuff. So you're going to get deeply immersed in all of these issues. So I won't spend much time on it now. A few more terms that come up all the time. The right side of my screen is obscured with pictures of the presenters. Is that true for everybody? I'm just curious. Nod your head if it's no? Great. Okay, so some more terms. Cost. Costs, the way costs for these systems are described is all over the place. And so when you're looking at costs, you have to be really careful to be sure you understand what you're talking about, whether it's dollars per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour or dollars per kilowatt, or dollars per kilowatt or dollars per megawatt. And you've got to know whether you're talking about cells, packs, systems, installations. As Dr. Juk mentioned, there are a lot of extra costs that go along with battery systems. It's not just the battery, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Capacity, we talked about. Duration refers to the number of hours that the battery can deliver power. And this is a shortcoming of current energy storage systems, current battery systems. It's all short duration. Wouldn't it be great to have duration that was seasonal so that you could store energy in the summer and use it in the winter? We're not there yet. And that would be a huge breakthrough. And even just a 10-hour, 12-hour, 20-hour battery would be a big breakthrough. And there are some energy storage systems that provide longer durations, and I'll talk a little bit about those. Cycles is the number of times the storage device can be charged and recharged, or charged and discharged before it starts to become less effective. Depth of discharge refers to the depth with which an energy storage system is discharged. So whether a battery is discharged completely or whether it's discharged in a very shallow way. And those are very closely related, because depending on how you use your battery will determine how long your battery will last, how many cycles you'll get out of it. And so you have to know how you're going to use the battery, how you want to use the battery over long periods of time when you design the battery system and build the battery system. Parasitic loads, as Dr. Juk mentioned, are important. They're often not included when talking about cycles and depth of discharge, so you have to know about, you have to keep that in mind. And round trip efficiency refers to the energy losses that occur. Every single energy storage system in the world is going to include energy losses, because you're taking energy that's generated in one place, then stored, and there are losses there, and then it's discharged and there are losses there. So in battery systems, 70 or 80% is pretty good. 80 to 90 to 95% is better. And again, parasitic loads play an important role in calculating what the round trip efficiencies might be. So going on to the next slide, here's a slide that you saw pretty much in Dr. Juk's presentation. I won't dwell on this. Energy storage battery deployments are on an exponential track in the United States, and yet there's only about 900, only about 1 gigawatt already installed, 2.5 gigawatts projected by 2023, and yet it still represents a very, very small percentage of US generation capacity. So if we're going to begin to meet generation capacity with energy storage, we have a really long way to go. And you'll see some more about this topic when Ray presents next week, and I later on in the series will talk a little bit more about this same topic. EVs right now, electric vehicles, are only still less than 1% of the vehicles sold in the United States, and those are expected to skyrocket. When there's, sorry, I don't remember the exact number, but when electric vehicles reach a relatively near threshold, it's liable to shift demand for electricity from daytime to nighttime, because people will be charging their electric vehicles at night. So that changes the whole utility landscape. Battery costs are dropping fast. You saw a slide like this in Dr. Juk's presentation. Let me note here that this is the battery pack price. This is not per cell. This is not installed costs. These are battery pack costs. And if you look at this curve, you see it flattening out towards the bottom. So costs are, the decrease in costs are slowing. However, we're hoping that the decrease in costs in other system components might increase, and so continue to bring costs down. Sometimes when you're looking at the total cost per system, you can have a factor of 5, multiplicative factor of 5. So 150 kilowatt per hour cell could end up being a 750 kilowatt hour system. That is the cell packed into packs, built into a system, and then installed, along with all the parasitic loads that Dr. Juk mentioned, the air conditioning, the safety systems, the land, and so on. So right now, battery energy storage deployments are distributed in this way. It's the lithium ion is the big ticket technology. Lead acid is about 5%, sodium sulfur is about 12%, flow batteries are about 5%. These are pretty old numbers, but I think they're probably still close, although lithium ion may be increasing its percentage over the others. And just as a little bit of information, as you look into that bottom right-hand corner, you can see some of the differences between these technologies. So lithium ion is a pretty short duration battery, whereas the flow batteries, the sodium sulfur, and the lead acid can be used for longer durations. here's a slide that I don't want to dwell on much at all, but the color coding goes along with the ISOs, PJM, Cal ISO, ERCOT, MISO, and so on. And you can see that most of the installed capacity has been, in large scale battery energy storage systems, has been in PJM ISO on the East Coast, a lot in Cal ISO, and then less in all of these other states. And frequency regulation. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you guys see my mouse when I use it as a pointer? Yeah. So frequency regulation is one of the big returns on the use of these batteries certainly in PJM and also in Cal ISO. And then these are some of the terms that Ray will get into next week, and they get ever increasing smaller amounts of capacity. Let's see. So as costs go down, duration goes up and size goes up. Back in 2008, a 1 megawatt, 15-minute battery at PJM was a big battery. And as Dr. Juk showed here, this picture shows a 300 megawatt battery that's approved for Pacific Gas and Electric, but there's already a 380 megawatt battery on track in Nevada, and then many much bigger projects. This slide is only about 6 months old, and it's already out of date. Energy storage industry is increasing at such a fast rate. So I'm going to fly through a bunch of different technologies, and just to give people a very wide-ranging overview of what's going on in the field. So you'll see that capacitors and flywheels make up a very small part of the energy storage landscape. Battery energy storage is still very, very small. Compressed air energy storage is still relatively small, and pumped hydro is the elephant in the room. It's where most of the energy storage is, but there are reasons why pumped hydro isn't booming now, like lithium ion and like battery energy storage in general. So pumped hydro is just that. You pump water up into a reservoir and then you let it run down, turning turbines on the way, making electricity. It's got all kinds of advantages. It's the largest now. It can potentially be used for long duration. It's high power capacity. It's a mature technology. It's got a reasonably high round trip efficiency, long life. However, it's tough to cite new pumped hydro projects in the world, partly because you need just the right geology, and partly because it's environmentally speaking, people are reluctant now to build these big storage facilities, water storage, and there's water losses associated with this. So that reservoir up there, if it's in a hot, arid environment like the Southwest, you lose a lot of water to evaporation. So there are drawbacks to pumped hydro, but it's the big technology, mostly because it was built in response to the nuclear energy technologies in the East in the decades past, when they were doing all this baseload generation and having these big generation facilities running 24/7. They wanted to do something with that electricity at night when nobody was using it. And so they built some pumped hydro storage systems. Compressed air is another system like pumped hydro. When you have excess electricity or cheap electricity, you pump the electricity down into the ground. And then when you want it as electricity again, you bring it back up, run it through turbines, make electricity. Again, potentially long duration, high capacity, long life, but hard to cite new installations. It's expensive, and you need just the right geology. You need salt caverns are common. There are other kinds of geologic repositories that can be used, but it's very expensive. It takes a lot of exploration to find the right geology. So again, great technology, but difficult to spread broadly. Flywheels, high capacity, high cycle life, fast response, but pretty limited use. There's a big installation down there in Pennsylvania that's being used largely for frequency and voltage regulation. Again, limited uses, old. It's an old, very old technology. Potter's wheels are flywheels, steam engines, cars, large scale energy storage, supercapacitors, again, big uses for a small market. It's an electrochem, it's a battery, just like the batteries that we were talking about all along, long cycle life, long life, high cycle life, broad applications, but limited. Again, not very useful for large scale arbitrage or load shifting, or the kinds of things that we're really looking to now. Concentrated solar power and thermal energy storage. I have a colleague here at Sandia who's working hard on this stuff. This generally refers to concentrating solar plants where you use mirrors to reflect the energy of the sun to a generator that gets up to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit and then melts some medium, maintain that medium stays very, very hot for long periods of time. And when you want that energy back, you boil water with it or some other heat exchange and turn turbines and make electricity. But it's just not taking off. It's my colleague Cliff Ho at Sandia, who gave me this slide, shows that all the battery storage in the United States in 2018, now this is already a very small, much smaller number than it is now, is dwarfed by single plants in 2 different locations, but this plant is already broken and not working. And so it's it's very expensive, and there's new technologies. It's on the rise, but still a little nascent in terms of R&D. Gravity energy storage, which Dr. Juk mentioned, can be long duration. There's high capital costs. It involves towers that have weights in them. You lift the weight when energy is cheap and you let it down when energy is more expensive. There's people building trains out in Nevada. A guy we know named Russ Weed is helping to develop that. The reason I'm going through all of these is because I see energy storage now like where mammals were at the end of the Cretaceous. So we had the age of the dinosaurs, these giant carnivorous reptiles that were eating every tiny mammal that they could find, and mammals were small and hiding, trying to stay out of the way of the giant carnivores. And when the dinosaurs disappeared, the mammals emerged with this radiation, this evolutionary radiation that we see on the planet now. And now there's mammals everywhere, and some of them are pretty big and dominant. And so right now, lithium ion batteries are the dinosaurs. We don't know what the booming technology is going to be in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, but it could come from many of these other technologies that I've already described, other battery technologies, which I'll describe in a minute, which Dr. Juk also described. And so we don't know where they're going to come from. They may come from many different sources, and it may be one of those all of the above solutions that includes battery energy or battery technologies and other energy storage technologies. So I'm fascinated by this. My colleague Ray tells me it's just chemistry, but it took me a while as I got into energy storage to figure out how a battery works, until I realized that it's just the same redox reactions that drive biological metabolism. So our bodies, all biological life on the planet is doing redox chemistry. And now we've figured out how to do redox chemistry in batteries and take that energy, store it, and use it as another time. Let me say a word, looking at this picture down at the bottom right, about how a battery works. So when the battery is being charged, we store electrical energy on one side of the battery. When it's being discharged, we run those electrons, or probably more accurately, the electromagnetic waves, through the circuitry to the other side of the battery. And then we want to reverse all of that. Well, we have primary batteries. The batteries that we all use frequently in the world are primary batteries. They run out well, they stop working after some period of time, and they're not secondary batteries. They aren't rechargeable. And I want to note that they don't run out of electricity. They don't run out of energy. They don't run out of electrons. But what happens is the whole system gets gummed up. And sorry, that's a technical term that some of my colleagues don't appreciate, but the whole system gets gummed up with secondary and tertiary electrochemical reactions that create precipitates and create other things that complicate the process, and so the battery stops working. And that's the same thing that happens in rechargeable secondary batteries, and that's what we're all trying to overcome right now in our technology development, is trying to create batteries which can be charged and recharged and charged and recharged many, many, many times without these secondary and tertiary chemical reactions taking place that cause the battery to stop working. So, so with that, let me say a few words about lithium ion. And since Dr. Juk mentioned this, I won't spend much time on it, but lithium ion is the lion's share of the battery market. Tesla here, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute of the lithium aluminum battery. There's lots of different chemistries being experimented with and being used. That's mostly why I wanted to show you this picture, is so you can see that there's not just one lithium ion chemistry. And here's why there are lots of lithium ion chemistries. Energy density varies dramatically across them. And if you're building a car, you want a battery with very high energy density. So Tesla has chosen this lithium aluminum oxide chemistry to build their car batteries, because you want a relatively small, light battery that packs a big punch. And that's part of the reason that lithium ion batteries are a little dangerous, because it's a lot of energy crammed into a small, tight space. Lead acid batteries, on the other hand, have a much lower energy density. So you might use a lead acid battery in your car to turn on the starter, to get the starter to run, but you wouldn't want to run your car on lead acid batteries because it would take way too many batteries and it'd be way too heavy. Lithium ion batteries, so a quick summary: high energy density, high cycle life, decreasing costs because they're following on the coattails of electric vehicles. They're ubiquitous, fast response. It's a great battery, except there's a few of these problems that Dr. Juk mentioned that are, that could become obstacles to greater development. Here's one of the reasons that fire is a problem. These are the batteries. This is a AA battery. Here's the 18650 battery that Tesla is using. This is the common ubiquitous lithium ion battery, and it takes over 7,000 cells to make a Tesla battery pack. So when one cell fails, one cell out of 7,000 cells fails and maybe creates a little tiny overheating problem, it can propagate through other cells, and so you end up with a bigger problem. An energy storage system like this big Miraloma system could require 6.7 million 18650 cells. So just a little bit about that landscape. Here's another kind of cell, sodium sulfur. It's a great technology. It's can be slightly longer term, and the problem with it is mostly that you have to keep, some would say that a problem with it is that you have to keep it at a very, very high temperature. So that means it is potentially dangerous. And you have to, even if you're not using the battery, you have to keep the battery hot. So there's a load associated just with using the battery. Lead acid batteries, which we've talked about already, great batteries for some uses. I used to live in a PV house before it was quite so fashionable, and we had a bunch of lead acid batteries in the outside the house in a little shed. And that was what we used to run our lights and our other things. It's fully recyclable. That's a great virtue of the lead acid batteries. The new lead carbon systems are liable to be a great battery, but it's very, very low density battery, so it can't be used in electrical vehicle applications, and there are other batteries that are better for large scale applications. Flow batteries, another completely different technology where you have the anolyte and the catholyte separated into two different receptacles. Then you flow those fluids together into a fuel cell. That's where the electrical discharge takes place. And there's virtues to that, which I won't try to get into right now, but it's still pretty much a nascent technology. It has potential. Maybe this will be one of the little mammals that rises up in decades to come. Zinc manganese oxide, which we at Sandia are working hard on. Really common materials, zinc and manganese, common in the Earth's crust. No pollution issues associated with them. Established supply chains, lots of factories for dealing with these sorts of things. So it could be a big breakthrough in battery technology, but again, it's still, the battery gets gummed up. Reversibility, making it into a secondary battery is problematic. And so that's the challenge with those. Hydrogen storage is just another battery. It's using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then when you want that energy back, you recombine them. It's basically redox chemistry all over again. I'm trying to rush through this because I know we're behind and we're going to end up a little bit behind. And sorry about that, Will, because I'm cutting into your time. But I think we can go over a little bit. I hope we can. I know nobody has any place to go, right? I mean, we're all shut down. So I hope that it's not too inconvenient for everybody. I'm on the last few slides. I want to talk just a little bit about the entire system that's required to run these battery storage systems, because it's not just batteries, as Dr. Juk mentioned. There's a lot of different components that come into it. There's the battery management system that regulates the way the batteries charge and discharge. There's the inverters and the power conversion systems that are important for changing it from DC to AC, the energy management systems that control loads and ramp rates, the site management systems, and there's the balance of the plant, which is all the other stuff that Dr. Juk mentioned, the housing, the HVAC, the wiring, and so on. All of this stuff causes the cost of the system to skyrocket over the cost of the cell, as I mentioned earlier. One of our experts on this process, Dan Borneo, makes an important point, and that is that when you're putting one of these systems in place, his view is that it's important to have a single entity responsible for the entire integration process, so that you have one entity that's overseeing it all and understands how all the pieces go together. And I'll tell you one other thing he says about this: it never works out of the box. And that's another thing we need to be able to master in the way we put these systems together. We need to build inverters so that they work more smoothly with batteries, and build the all the power control systems so that they work better with the inverters, and so on. And that's something that we don't always do so well. There are many, many other topics that go along with this overview topic, some of which Will's going to talk about right now in his overview of policy, but there's economics, which Ray and Patrick will talk about next time. There's modeling, which we're not even going to get much into. There's design and commissioning, which I just mentioned very, very briefly. Safety, and then, as Dr. Juk mentioned, decommissioning and end-of-life issues are a big deal if we're going to build sustainable, resilient, long-term systems that will keep serving us for a long time to come. There are many, many resources available out there at your fingertips for you to get into. And I know that you all have this presentation, and you'll have all the presentations, and so you can refer back to them. So I won't spend a lot of time going over these. Dr. Juk mentioned the Energy Storage Systems website, the Energy Storage Database. Clean Energy States Alliance has a lot of resources available. Dr. Juk mentioned the STAP program, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, which has a lot of stuff on the web, and especially webinars that CESA, the Clean Energy States Alliance, puts on regularly. So there's a big archive of webinars that you can go back to and play at your leisure and learn a lot about all of these topics. These three at the bottom, things I find really useful: Utility Dive provides lots of information. You can get a daily feed on various topics. The Energy Storage Association has a lot going on. And something I found really useful, the Energy Transition Show, which is a podcast with 2 new issues every month, 2 new editions every month on many different topics having to do with energy transition. And there's a lot to learn there. So in summary, battery technology is improving, spreading, getting cheaper. It's expected to boom. It's going to be a part of the energy landscape in the decades to come. However, there's much more battery capacity with longer durations required to meet the demand that we think we're going to need. There are issues associated with batteries that haven't been tackled fully. There are supply chain issues, toxicity, waste, end-of-life issues, social issues, and so on. So those are all things that need to be addressed. Lithium ion is the elephant in the room, but there's a lot of other chemistries and a lot of other technologies that can still arise. Batteries can provide a lot of important services to the grid, many of which have established value streams, but some of which don't, like resilience, as Dr. Zhuk mentioned. And PV and batteries are already now today outcompeting new and existing gas peaker plants, which just recently were outcompeting coal plants. So with that, I will stop. I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues at Sandia and PNNL and around the country who are helping me put these workshops together. Special thanks to Dr. Zhuk, who makes this all possible. And I encourage you to write to me or call me. There's my contact info if you have questions that we can address later on. One thing I want to say is that there is no reason why this set of workshops, this series, should be a one-off with the Maryland PSC. We would be delighted to continue our interactions with Maryland in the months or years to come as other issues come up. What you're going to see over the next series of workshops, over the next month or so, is largely overview information. Any one of these topics, I talked about a bunch of them today. Will's going to go over a bunch of them if I leave him any time. And any of those could be drawn out into, hour-long sessions or day-long sessions if, folks were sufficiently interested. So I encourage you to observe these presentations and think about where you might like to dig in more deeply. So with that, thanks very much. If I can't answer your questions, I think there are probably others on the line who might be able to. So thank you very much, Molly. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take just a quick minute now to see if anybody has any questions for Howard. If you are in the webinar, you can go to the Q&A box. If you would like, you can also raise your hand and I can unmute folks so they can ask questions kind of without having to type them out.
Molly, would you unmute Dr. Zhuk and Will and Ray?
Absolutely.
Just in case there's a question that comes up that they are more appropriate for answering.
Yeah, so all the panelists are available to answer questions now. And I'm looking for attendees to see if there's any hands raised. I don't see any. I know there was one question during the presentation, but it appears to have gotten answered. So I'm also, real quick, I'm going to pause the recording for about 5 minutes now, give everybody a quick break, stretch your legs, use the restroom, get a glass of water if you need to. We will start this again at, I'm looking at 3 different clocks. Let's go with 1:18. So I'm going to pause here and we'll start up again in just a couple minutes with Will's presentation. We may go a couple minutes over. I hope everybody will bear with us. If folks do need to leave at 2 o'clock, as I said, this will be available as a recording afterwards if you don't catch the end of it. So I will pause now and we'll see everybody in a couple minutes and we'll give one more opportunity for questions at that point. Oh, yeah, kitty.
Molly, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. And can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and the recording is paused, but I think all the attendees can still hear us.
Okay.
So we're going to start up again in about 1 more minute. Thank you, Chairman. I was muted. I was trying to read your question. So this question was for Dr. Zook and Howard, but they're not on. I'm hoping, Will, you can answer this. The chairman stated that the presenters so far have cited 2 examples of storage projects in a number of states. Based on your experience, in states where storage projects are thriving, do you attribute any of the success to the actions of the state regulators? And are there any quick suggestions for the Maryland PSC?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that I will defer to Dr. Zook and particularly Ray Byrne on that. We are supporting energy storage projects across the country in varying states of regulatory reform. We have projects that are still in vertically integrated markets, and we have projects that are in competitive markets. So in that sense, I don't think that the regulatory policy is necessarily driving the projects that we are subsidizing and supporting. I think that there is opportunity, particularly now with the Grand Challenge that the Department of Energy is sponsoring for a number of cities end use customers to participate and apply for funding for energy storage projects. So my message there is that it's not limited to, let's say, competitive markets compared to vertically integrated. We're really seeing the support for projects across the country. But if Ray is back on, he may have some further comments. Or Dr. Zook.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the limit to some degree is the amount of available funds. But we are doing some very small projects, for example, with the Navajo tribe. We are doing very large projects. We are trying to do a geographically dispersed sort of approach, where we have projects on the West Coast, the East Coast, in the middle, in the South. And at the moment, we try to pick particularly promising projects. Now, of course, as energy storage becomes more popular, there are going to be more and more promising projects. And then, as I mentioned, funds will be a limitation.
Chairman, I have unmuted you if you want to follow up. You just need to unmute on your end if you're in. There we go.
There we go. No, thank you, Doctor, and to the other panelists as well. I appreciate that. As we look forward to this series of conferences, that's something I want to keep an eye on in terms of what we as regulators could do, how we can influence. We may not necessarily be able to assist with any additional funding or providing the grants, but in terms of regulatory approaches or reducing barriers, that'll be an aspect that I'll keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's very important because eventually utilities will come up with projects, or municipalities for that matter, and they will expect to put it into the tariff. And you have to decide how you're going to handle that.
All right, and if everybody takes a look at their chat very quickly, Jeremy shared a link to a paper that was written about storage policies and the rationale for different approaches. So that's in your chat window, and I will circulate that to the work group after the meeting. All right, so I don't see any other questions at this point. So Will, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Molly, so much for coordinating this virtual workshop. We really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you. Of course, we wish that we were doing this in person, but thank you for accommodating the virtual aspect. I really look forward to the future workshops in the coming weeks. I'll give you just a bit about my background before I plunge into my presentation. I am a policy analyst with Sandia National Labs. I have spent my entire career in the energy and utility industry with a focus on regulatory and legislative policy. So for about the last 25 years, I have been working with utilities across the country. And to say that it's been an exciting time in the industry is certainly an understatement. I've had the fortune of working through deregulation and restructuring issues, smart grid issues, and now to be involved at this very exciting time for energy storage is a real privilege for me. Of course, I want to start out with the thank you and gratitude to Dr. Zook. The research that I'm going to be presenting in this presentation is, of course, funded by the Department of Energy, Office of Electricity, under the sponsorship of Dr. Zook. So we certainly very much appreciate his support. Energy storage policy is going to be the focus of my presentation. So I plan to cover the following topics. I'd like to provide a historical context for utility industry policy making. ensure that we all understand the distinct roles between the federal government and state responsibilities. I'm going to touch upon key federal activity to date, and then spend the majority of my time talking about policy issues at the state level, hopefully providing some best practices and insights to what states have done, the ones that have really moved forward with energy storage policy. And then finally, give you some thoughts, considerations for state regulators. To be clear, Sandia does not advocate any position on energy storage. Our objective is to educate, inform, and help commissions as they sort through the myriad issues associated with energy storage. So my presentation, along with the others, will be distributed to you so that you can refer back to it later on. The page that I'm showing now is a list of acronyms that you may find useful as you review later on. So to start out with the historical and jurisdictional context, for the last century, the energy and utility industry has really not been subject to change in any significant form. The monopoly system was in place for most of the 1900s. And we started to see a complete restructuring towards the middle part of the 1990s. And certainly we're in a situation now where I believe policy is becoming and remaining a consistent catalyst for reform in what has been a very slow to change industry. So going back to 1978 when PURPA was finalized at the federal level, we started to see some real change take place, focused on energy conservation and the use of renewables. Certainly FERC's order in 1999, Order 2000, which created the RTO system across the country, was a huge and very significant order. Then as we started to evolve into the 2000s, we started to see the federal government provide subsidies for smart grid technologies. That was through the ARRA Act that was under the Obama administration. We started to see greater support for renewables, diversity in fuels. And then more recently, we have started to see federal policy that is specific to energy storage. So in 2018, two very significant orders came from FERC, Order 841, which directed RTOs to enable energy storage to play on an equal playing field with other generation sources. Order 845 revised interconnection policies to enable energy storage. So you can see the evolution in our industry where policy has really been instrumental in moving certain technologies forward. Want to be sure that we're all clear on the distinction between federal and state jurisdiction. On the federal level, we have FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have Congress and other agencies that to one degree or another may become involved in clean energy policies such as the EPA. But under FERC's jurisdiction, we have rules governing the wholesale markets. We have rules governing transmission lines. And then the Congress has certainly become involved with offering the investment tax credit for solar. There was effort to have a standalone tax credit for storage that did not pass, but a tax credit is still available for storage that is paired with solar. On the state side, of course, we have public utility commissions, state legislatures, and oftentimes executive directives from governors. And these speak to the retail markets, operations of distribution networks, the setting of utility rates, and other enabling policies that may be supportive of energy storage. And we're really starting to see that level of activity increase, which again is going to be the focus of my comments here. So again, back to the federal activities, we have FERC playing that very important role, directing RTOs to remove barriers for energy storage in the wholesale markets. All of the RTOs were required to respond to FERC, establishing new rules and tariff design that open the capacity, energy, and ancillary services to energy storage. This is an ongoing process. All of the RTOs have submitted their plans. They're still under review in large respect. There's been preliminary approval for PJM's plan and the Southwest Power Pool's plan, but other RTOs are still under review with FERC. Obviously, the FERC Order 841 does not apply to Texas. Texas is its own unique market. It is not under FERC's regulation, and the FERC order does not apply to vertically integrated or non-RTO markets as well. As I mentioned, the congressional activity to define storage ITC was not successful. We would hope to see something picked up again, but that's certainly hard to predict in these uncertain times. So turning to state policy, according to the Energy Storage Association, US states generally fall into 4 categories as they assess energy storage policy development. So this is kind of a pendulum that can swing back and forth. These are not mutually exclusive categories, but we see a lot of states starting to just initiate an investigation of energy storage. They may hold workshops, they may hold briefings, but they've not carved out any type of substantive policy yet. The next level would be clarifying states that are revisiting their existing rules, perhaps their interconnection rules, their net metering rules, their fire and building codes, to see how they may need to be revised to enable energy storage. The next level, becoming a bit more sophisticated, would be states that are actively encouraging energy storage through procurement targets, pilot demonstrations, project funding, or other mandates. And then, probably the highest level would be states. We could throw California into that, of course, New York, Hawaii, and I'll touch on all of those states as we proceed. But states that are really aggressively, if you will, focused on energy storage, developing long-term resource planning that includes energy storage, developing resource valuation efforts, grid modernization, or very sophisticated distribution planning. But with respect to these efforts, a number of barriers still exist with regard to energy storage deployment. I would offer that barriers tend to fall into 4 categories. Again, there can be overlap, and these are not mutually exclusive, but there are certainly regulatory issues that need to be addressed at the federal and state level, taking a look at these historical legacy policies that really do not lend themselves to energy storage and need to be revisited. There are economic issues, there are utility and developer business model issues, and there are technology issues. Typically what we're seeing is that policy issues at the state level will likely need to be correlated, in other words, intended to address one or more of these barriers. So the policy issues that I'm going to be talking about typically correlate with one or more of these 4 barriers. Furthermore, within these categories, a regulatory commission may prioritize policy issues based on their unique situation and the factors that they've identified as being barriers within their state. So as we dive into what are these policy issues, I would offer that there are 10 key policy issues that each of the 50 US states plus territories will need to develop to one degree or another policy around these issues. Now, you may wonder why I've put into bold the first 4. That is based on my understanding of where Maryland is today and issues that are likely to be reviewed in dockets that are coming up as soon as April. So in my presentation, I'm going to give more emphasis to these four, but to run through them really quickly, utility ownership is a key issue. Multiple use applications for energy storage, cost benefit analysis, distribution system modeling, procurement mandates, incentives or tax credits, inclusion of storage in utility integrated resource plans, changes to net metering policies, changes to renewable portfolio standards, and changes to interconnection standards. And as you see in the brackets, I've correlated that each policy issue with a barrier that I described on the previous page. So let's dive in and first take a look at utility ownership. The policy issue that surrounds utility ownership is that historically, energy storage tends to be classified as generation. And built into policy, particularly in restructured markets, are oftentimes prohibitions from utilities owning generation assets. So inherently, policy may restrict ownership in certain cases. There are a number of states that are closely monitoring this issue and in that process determining whether or not they want to have utilities own energy storage. And as they do that, there's a number of pros and cons that can be examined. On the pro side, when you have utility ownership, there's certainly an opportunity for long-range system-wide planning. There's an opportunity to use storage to optimize the distribution grid. There's perhaps more flexibility to use cost-effective resources. And there's a benefit of enhanced economies of scale. The larger utility projects we have for energy storage, it's likely that prices will decline. On the flip side, on the con side, there are considerations around market power. If utilities own energy storage, does that give them an advantage over third parties in creating an unlevel playing field? Also, there are uncertainties about cost recovery. If a utility has the opportunity to own energy storage, are they going to be able to recover those costs through rate base? If there's any uncertainty around that, it's going to be a disincentive for a utility to want to make that investment. That also leads into the question around equitable rate treatment among customers. Who's going to pay for it? If it's in rate base, will customers pay equally? Will there be differences in how that cost is recovered? Those are unanswered questions in many instances and can create a barrier around the utility ownership issue. Now, we have several points of reference around utility ownership that I'd like to make sure you're aware of. In New York, which has been undergoing a multi-year process that is called Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, that is the comprehensive energy policy strategy in New York. Under this system in the state of New York, utilities will be operating a distributed energy resource platform. And in that platform, utilities theoretically should be neutral about what resources provide grid services. Originally, New York prohibited utilities from owning behind the meter distributed energy resources, which would include storage, again, based on those concerns about market power. That has been challenged, and in revisions to the REV policy, there's been an acknowledgement that energy storage is unique and that some exceptions to utility ownership should be pursued on a performance-based regulation approach, meaning that if a utility can make a case that for reliability purposes, they should have ownership rights, that's something that would be considered on a case-by-case basis. Then we have another example, the state of Texas. Again, Texas is not under FERC's jurisdiction, but Texas was restructured in the late 1990s. And due to legacy regulations, Texas defines energy storage as generation and has placed that the transmission and distribution utilities cannot own generation. As part of Texas's restructuring, those generation assets had to be sold. Texas has no capacity market. There's no opportunity for frequency regulation or arbitrage. So there's been a question of, well, you know, what would a utility want to own energy storage for anyway? However, AEP Texas petitioned the commission to own 2 battery storage assets, and a decision on that has not been made. The PUCT, Public Utility Commission of Texas, has deferred to the Texas legislature to make a decision on this. And there has not, and co-ops can own energy storage assets in certain circumstances. So really, I think that Texas should be considered a battleground on the issue of utility ownership. It's going to be very interesting to see how that state ends up on this issue. Other points of reference that I would draw to your attention would be Colorado and Oregon. In Colorado, Xcel Energy has submitted a plan to the PUC intending to replace all of their coal-fired generating plants with utility-owned storage. And so that plan is moving forward in Colorado. In Oregon, there's been a regulatory directive that requires utilities to submit multiple scenarios for energy storage for their resource planning efforts. And in those plans include multiple ownership scenarios. So it's likely that in Oregon, we may see utilities lobby for ownership rights. We are seeing various ownership models for energy storage emerge. And I know that this is up in Maryland, what we're seeing in Oregon. As a heads up, I will be covering ownership issues in much greater detail in a subsequent workshop that I believe is scheduled 2 weeks from now. But at a high level, what we're seeing is 4 different models emerging for utility ownership. The first would be outright utility ownership. The utility owns and controls the storage project and manages storage for grid reliability. Also in that model, the utility can operate storage in wholesale markets when it's not needed for distribution reliability. So that would be a pretty clean-cut, clear model in which utilities own storage outright. The second model would be more of a hybrid where a utility can share storage for distribution grid reliability, and then the third party would operate that storage project for wholesale market opportunities. Third model would be utilities really not involved at all. There's a third party ownership. The utility could contract with storage project for grid reliability services, but really the third party has the majority of control and ownership rights. The third party would also operate the project in wholesale markets. The fourth, which I think is a very interesting model and may have some legs to it and could really be a good compromise, would be the virtual power plant model, in which a utility would aggregate on their own or use a third-party aggregator to receive grid services from multiple distributed energy resource projects that could be owned by a third party or could be owned by the utility. But it's the point in that model is to really take multiple small projects, aggregate them together, and have the benefit of both grid reliability and opportunity for wholesale transactions. So again, if this is an issue that you'd like to hear more about, please join us in 2 weeks. I'll be doing some state-by-state comparisons, looking at actual scenarios for ownership models. But policy issues that I think should be considered by state regulators when they're looking at utility ownership would be, first and foremost, how does a state regulator ensure that utilities are not going to gain an opportunity for market manipulation or one that would stifle competition, growth, and innovation if the utility owns the generating assets, the storage assets. Secondly, how can state regulators ensure that a level playing field will exist for third-party providers to come in? Will the rate basing of energy storage investments drive down market value of services? And also, what are the regulatory limitations of rate-based investments? How will the cost recovery process work? How will rate design work? What customers will be impacted? This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the key utility ownership policy issues that I believe need to be sorted through at the state level. So if you have any questions, please tee them up. I'm going to save the questions until I get to the end of the presentation. We'll move on to the second policy issue that I'd like to discuss with you, and that's multiple use applications. What the policy issue on this topic is that energy storage has unique. Energy storage can be both load and supply. So how should it be used? Is there opportunity to both support the grid reliability and sell services for energy storage at the wholesale market? Can that be done simultaneously? This is an issue that states will need to look at. It's also an issue that's being addressed at the wholesale level through those RTO filings. But on the pro side is that if a state is to consider multiple uses of energy storage, that will enable its full economic potential rather than just limiting energy storage to a grid reliability function. Also, composite forms of compensation can combine energy, capacity, environmental, locational, and demand relief value. And so as we start to talk about cost benefit analysis for energy storage, it's really important to make sure that all of the various uses of energy storage are considered. Now, on the con side, most energy storage installations today consist of either behind the meter installations or grid tied applications, but typically not both. So by that situation, there's kind of a clear line between distribution services and wholesale services. And therefore that may preclude looking at storage in its full scope of services. Another con to this is that some uses may have higher priority than others, reliability, for instance. And so it may create conflicts in a marketplace if a state wants to not only have reliability services, but also look at wholesale transactions, and it can just kind of muddy the scope of services. That would be an argument on the con side. But nevertheless, multiple use applications is an emerging area for policy making. This is happening in multiple states, and there are some trends identifying the services that energy storage can provide across multiple segments of our industry. There are bulk energy services where storage can look at providing services around energy time shift and arbitrage, buying low, selling high, supporting electric supply capacity. On the ancillary services side, oftentimes at the wholesale market, there are frequency regulation services, spinning and non-spinning supplemental reserves, voltage support, black start services. On the capital expenses, which are often quite expensive, and so that can help a utility defer some of those costs. There's a service around transmission congestion relief. On the distribution side, there is the opportunity to defer distribution system upgrades. There's the opportunity for voltage support. And then finally, on the customer energy management side, there are services around power quality, power reliability, retail electric energy time shift, and demand charge management. So these are all distinct value sets for energy storage that need to be evaluated independently and ultimately priced so that we know what the worth is, either at the wholesale level or on the retail side. And so to varying degrees, states are looking at how to do this. Now, not surprisingly, California was one of the first. In 2018, California became the first state to issue revenue stacking rules for energy storage projects. The state developed a set of 11 rules on revenue stacking. And there is a series of dockets and working groups that the state is still leading to address how these services should be compensated and how that affects metering installations, how it affects rate design. And so there's not a definitive answer yet, but definitely keep California on your radar because, as is often the case, they're setting precedent for this. Oregon is another state that really has risen to the forefront on this topic of multiple use applications. Oregon followed California's lead with guidelines for the regulated utilities in that state that is associated with their energy storage mandate. And so the way this is working in practice is that the Oregon PUC has provided guidelines encouraging projects from the utilities that would stack revenues and ultimately would support projects that can serve multiple applications. Portland General Electric responded to this order at the PUC, indicating that it is pursuing energy storage projects that provide multiple services. So energy shifting and arbitrage, ancillary services, avoiding renewable curtailment, system peaking and capacity value, and locational value. So again, the emphasis is being placed in Oregon on projects that energy storage projects that can serve multiple applications, provide multiple value streams instead of just limiting to one, such as grid reliability. I would offer that on this policy topic for state regulators, there should be considered. Number one is, how should multiple use applications be prioritized? For instance, does system reliability have a greater value than other services? Secondly, how will multiple values for energy storage be tracked? In California, for instance, resources interconnected on the transmission side are restricted from providing services to distribution domains. So again, it's a Chinese wall, if you will, between the two in California. So that may have to be looked at the state level as well. Thirdly, how can behind the meter energy storage services provide grid services, and how should they be priced? Going back to the FERC RTO process, this is an issue that has come up, particularly with PJM's filing and the issue around dual participation. How can energy storage support distribution grid services, but also be allowed to participate in the wholesale market? So again, no definitive answers to this, but it's a key policy issue that's being debated. The third topic that I'd like to move into is cost-benefit analysis. Now, the policy issue on this topic is currently the market structures in our industry and policies lack clear mechanisms to identify and capture the full value of energy storage. This is a very big challenge for the industry in the sense that there's not a definitive universal approach to estimating costs and benefits for energy storage. There have been some state-specific approaches and regional approaches, but as a general statement, the industry is lacking a go-to resource to how to price out energy storage. Now, the pro, and why we need this ultimately, is that cost effectiveness is going to be one of the two tests that usually will be used to establish an energy storage procurement target. So what is the rate of return on an energy storage investment? Therefore, determining what are the amounts that should be deployed. If we don't know the cost and we're lacking clear indications of the value of certain benefits, that becomes a big challenge for regulators. Accurate cost and benefit modeling, if we have it, is certainly going to support utility cost recovery applications. Certainly, if we have a strong cost-benefit analysis, then market participants would have a better sense around, well, which customer sets are going to benefit the most from energy storage, which customer sets have the greatest need for energy storage. So these comments on the left side underscore the very important need for a reliable cost-benefit framework that can be used. Now, the con, and what I would say are really the challenges around this, is that we don't have it. We don't have a universal cost-benefit framework at this point. There's no universal approach toward defining costs and benefits of energy storage. Assessing the viability of energy storage is therefore a challenge. There are technologies that are in varying states of maturity. That's changing all of the time. So it's very hard to get a handle on costs. There's also a wide range of performances when we start to look at various kinds of energy storage. So depending on if you're looking at batteries or some other form of energy storage, there's going to be a wide scope of variances in both efficiencies and cost. But nevertheless, states are taking the lead on developing their own cost-benefit analysis. In Minnesota, which I'll use as a reference point, legislation in that state directed the Department of Commerce to conduct an energy storage cost-benefit analysis, obviously specific to the state of Minnesota. They hired a outside consulting firm to come in and perform this study for them, but the analysis is publicly available. I've provided the link here for you. I would encourage you to go to that cost-benefit analysis and see to what extent principles established in Minnesota can be transferable to another state. There are some key takeaways from Minnesota's analysis. Minnesota found that in their state, solar plus storage is cost effective today. Standalone storage could become cost effective in 2025. Minnesota also found that over the next 10 years, storage will show increasingly positive cost-benefit ratios for more and more use cases as technology costs decline. In Minnesota, they determined that the 324 megawatt peaking capacity that exists in the state could be mimicked by 4-hour duration energy storage. And lastly, the findings were that Minnesota utilities and throughout the Midwest ISO region should include storage in planning studies, resource plans, and procurement for new generation. So you can see how this cost-benefit analysis translates into regulatory policy and regulatory support, and also makes it that much easier for a utility that is submitting procurement plans to be able to refer back to the cost-benefit analysis in Minnesota. So I think that the issues that surround cost-benefit analysis, which I'm going to go through here, nevertheless don't take away from the importance of a state conducting their own cost-benefit analysis in the absence of having a universal framework to rely on. So the policy considerations that I would say are really key within the topic of cost benefit. Most of the benefit costs that we have at our fingertips have been based solely on energy benefits of storage, ignoring many other non-energy benefits such as job creation, reduced land use, reduced grid outages, and higher property values. And so to have a very comprehensive cost benefit analysis what steps can be taken to ensure that the analysis is capturing those non-energy benefits. Secondly, how can a cost-benefit analysis for energy storage ensure that multiple applications are included and address the unique configurations of energy storage based on where that facility is located? So referring back to the multiple uses that I just talked about, how can we ensure that a cost-benefit analysis is including all of those applications? And then thirdly, what external resources are available to regulators? Oftentimes we hear that state commissions do not have the resources internally to conduct such a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. So where do they go? It's certainly something that Sandia can assist with. There are also third-party consulting firms, but oftentimes that's a challenge for states, is knowing how to go about it. So let's turn to the fourth topic.
I'm gonna jump in for 1 second, Will. So
Sure.
we are at 2 o'clock. So I'm thinking at this point, let's go through issue 4, and then let's have some Q&A, and maybe we can pick up the rest of the presentation at the beginning of our next workshop. Because I don't want to go too much past maybe 2:15.
Sure, I understand. And again, this presentation will be made available. I think in most instances, it's pretty self-explanatory, so happy to share and follow up with any additional questions. But the fourth policy issue that my understanding is going to be pretty key to Maryland is distribution system modeling. And so what the issue is here is that much of new storage that's going to be deployed is expected to be connected to distribution feeders. That's just kind of a universal market statement. And so the issue is, should utilities be required to develop distribution modeling plans and include energy storage in those plans? Now, on the pro side, effective distribution modeling supports optimal storage sizing, placement, operation. Distribution modeling provides location power quality improvements, mitigation of voltage deviation, frequency regulation, load shifting, etc. On the con side, utilities may opt for the least cost alternative over maximum benefit solutions. So does the regulator want the utility in the position to do this modeling and then say, well, we think energy storage should be placed here and not there? Is that a role that the utility should have? And there are significant consequences for that, because misusing or mislocating energy storage in distribution networks can have a negative effect of degrading power quality, reducing reliability, as well as load control. Nevertheless, again, we have 2 states that are requiring this type of modeling, California and New York. The CPUC in California has required the 3 IOUs to submit distribution resource plans. Again, very specific on the distribution grid, around circuit lines, where energy storage should be placed, how it will be integrated, etc. In New York, the REV model envisions utilities acting as these distribution platform providers. And so in that process, there's been some discussion around utilities deciding, which energy storage applications come onto the grid, how they might be prioritized. And so there's an interesting dynamic that utilities don't own the storage in New York, but yet they still have a role in determining, how it can be prioritized. Distribution system modeling can take many forms. So this bulleted list that I'm displaying right now shows you how different states are approaching it. Just a quick run through, I've highlighted Maryland. Requirements for utilities to file distribution system or grid modernization plans exist in California, Hawaii, Indiana, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and New York. Directives to file 5-year distribution system plans describing how utilities will prioritize distribution resources. That is in your state of Maryland, also in Michigan. You can see other approaches, requiring utilities to conduct hosting capacity analysis, consideration of cost-effective non-wires alternatives, locating net benefits for distributed energy resources. So it's, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It can take multiple forms. Policy considerations I would leave you with on this topic would be Energy storage will continue to pose challenges for distribution planning. There's insufficient resources, inadequate transmission corridors. How will these challenges be addressed at the state level? Secondly, how can regulators ensure consistency between distribution modeling and other planning requirements, such as integrated resource plans, grid modernization, et cetera? Thirdly, what is the best tool to use? What's out there in the marketplace? What is the best tool to use to demonstrate distribution functions? So I will stop right there. As you can see, these topics are very dense. There's a lot of components to them. And going back to that original list of 10 policy issues, we could spend a whole 2 hours just on any one given topic. But I look forward to entertaining your questions now, and we'll figure out with Molly how to focus additional workshops on issues that are of greatest importance to you. So Molly, with that, I'll stop, and if you want to open it up to questions.
Great, thank you so much. So I am getting questions from a couple of places. Our legislative director, Lisa, has been watching on YouTube, and so she texted and I provided to Amanda, which has popped up in the Q&A. For the key storage policy issues that you identified, Will, what, if any, role do you see for state legislatures? Should PSC and industry be coordinating with the legislature for clarifying laws, or are you seeing states focus on the regulatory level?
So it's a really good question. I'm a little hesitant to use the word should, again, because Sandia doesn't advocate any particular policy or approach. But what I'm finding is that it's a mixed bag. In some states, we have the legislature taking the lead. In other states, we have regulatory commissions taking the lead. Also, we have state governors issuing directives, and oftentimes those are tied into broader state initiatives around 100% renewables, 100% clean energy initiatives that correlate to energy storage. So without saying, one entity should be the leading force, I think it's critically important that the regulators work in tandem with the other entities, such as the legislature, such as the governor's office, to ensure that any policies coming out of the regulatory commission are consistent with other policy directives.
All right, so that's it from the Q&A. If any other attendees want to raise their hands, and I can allow them to ask out loud, or if anybody wants to submit anything else into the Q&A. And then, of course, we're going to do this 3 more times, and the experts will be on each call that we have. So there will be additional opportunities to ask questions later.
Molly, if I could, in just 1 minute, I put up a new slide here that I think is important as a takeaway. Approximately 15 states have developed some type of substantive energy storage policy as of the first quarter of 2020. At this time, these states represent best practices. So as you can see across the board here, these are what I consider to be the go-to states for best practices across these various policy issues. So again, a good reference point as the audience continues to review my presentation.
Okay, so we have another one in the Q&A. This is from Chuck Brody. Can you focus some comments within the 4 categories around differences between utility-led versus third-party, especially behind the meter initiatives? Would you agree that the former still have the upper hand to garner sponsorship and investment? How can policy mediate in favor of more diversity of ownership and project investment?
Well, so under a regulated environment, a regulatory commission has jurisdiction over utilities. And so the utilities would be looking at either behind the meter applications or in front of the meter applications. Again, very difficult to make a general statement because different states are restructured in different ways. But I think going forward, we are seeing the large scale utility owned applications that support long-term resource planning and the the decentralization of historical coal-fired generation or large centralized stations. We're seeing utilities move away from that paradigm into a more distributed energy paradigm that includes energy storage. So we've already been seeing that activity happen over the last several years, but what I think is really exciting is the next wave of aggregated behind the meter installations. To the extent that utilities can support that among their customers, to the extent that states can offer tax credits, other subsidies or incentives that help end-use customers build energy storage at customer-sited locations. I think then we can evolve into this virtual power plant scenario that I mentioned, that really can provide multiple value streams, supporting the grid at the distribution level, potentially participating in wholesale markets. And I think that that is a real opportunity that both states and the utilities that are regulated within those states can work together to support.
All right, so we are just about at time. I don't see any other questions in the queue. I want to thank the presenters very much for presenting in this manner. I think this is the first time all of us have done a webinar, both as presenters and as host. In these unusual circumstances, I think it went as well as could have possibly been expected. We will be doing this 3 more times. So if any of the audience members, attendees, have any suggestions or notes or tips, anything that worked well or anything that didn't, any other feedback, please provide that to me, and we will take that into consideration and see if we can improve for any of the future presentations. And with that, thank you so much to Dr. Zook, Ray, Will, Howard. I appreciate the service that you're providing to the PSCs. Wait, there's one in the Q&A. Sorry, I have one more question in the Q&A.
Sure.
For the PSC/Molly, are the PC 44 meetings the only way the average homeowner/commercial customers get insight to what the PSC is doing? Are there other ways they would hear about and more importantly contribute to the conversation? So, all of our proceedings are public. This has been publicized as well. We put out notices and members of the public can come to any of the hearings. We always have an opportunity for them to provide insight. As far as them knowing what is going on, the PC 44 meetings are generally only circulated within the work groups, but we do circulate more broadly the public hearings, and the utility filings when they come in will likely have a public process with comment and evidentiary hearings. If the press were to pick up on those, we could certainly consider putting out press releases to publicize them more widely. But other than that, our normal processes are what's available for the public to know what's going on. So with that, thank you, everyone. Please send in any feedback you might have. And with that, I'm going to close out the meeting.
Thanks, Molly.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone have a great day and wash your hands.
Thanks, Molly.
Yep.